for coming back from the break. It's good to see that some folks came back. I appreciate your taking the time to be here, and I recognize the responsibility of sharing a few thoughts with you. I don't claim to have all the answers, and hopefully I'll ask some questions that might help you find some, but I will share some thoughts about this time that we're in, about this period of change and the opportunities it presents and some of the challenges it present. Grateful for those of you in the audience who are our partners in the journey that we've been on as a company and the things we're working on. As we just heard earlier, collaboration and partnership is a really key theme in many, many industries, and of course ours included, and it's easier said than done. I think I find as we work on partnerships and collaboration that there's things that are sort of built into us in some ways as individuals that can be barriers, and I'll talk about a few of those. So if I had a chalkboard, and this is a large-sized chalkboard up here, and I wrote this statement: change is, what would you say? You know, and I hear some voices out there. Some people might say scary, threatening, frustrating. Some people might say exciting, thrilling. Some people might say inevitable or happening all around us, whether we like it or not. And I think all of those in some way are accurate. We're in a time that I would argue is perhaps unprecedented in terms of the pace of change. And even for folks like myself who actually enjoy change to a degree, it's startling and sometimes it's unsettling, but it's here. And I want to talk about what we can do about it, kind of a little bit about what it means for us as an industry and some of the things we're doing about it and what it might mean for you and some of the things that it implies for us. One of the challenges in working for a large institution, and maybe any institution, is that we have things we got to deliver today and tomorrow and next week, and there's things in process. You're working on big projects right now that need to be delivered. And so the art of progress is to be able to preserve order amidst all this change, but yet at the same time preserve change amidst order. And if you're part of a process-driven organization, that many of us are, sometimes preserving change amidst order is as difficult as preserving order amidst change. So just for context, what's happening in the world around us, and this is not a laundry list, but there's some really significant things going on that impact how we do what we do that need to be factored in. Perhaps more than ever before, we have information. Now, some of that information is accurate, some of it may not be. It comes in all sorts of forms, and social media as a trend has been really interesting in what it's done, but there's clearly all kinds of political unrest, and there's social unrest, all parts of the world. There's struggles with labor and owners and all kinds of things. There's natural unrest. There's all kinds of natural disasters that happen on a regular basis. In fact, I think we get numb to them in some cases. We hear about floods or landslides, and we just go to the next story. But what that's leading to are changes in laws, changes in legislation, changes in perception. It used to be several years ago that building a LEED certified building was a really exciting big deal. There are countries today where that's the price of entry. You can't not build something that's energy efficient. You have to take that into account in everything that you do. So these are happening. I talked to someone just before this about population. You know, in about the year 2025, the number of people retired in the United States will about equal the number of people working in the United States. That's a really interesting dynamic. And when you add that to a reverse population pyramid that's been happening in many developed countries around the world for years, you get some really, really interesting dynamics in all kinds of markets. I think 2029 or 2030, the global population is going to start to decline. And as much panic as there was about overpopulation and not having enough food, I think many of us that are in the building industry are going to have some new challenges to face when populations start to decline. Changes a lot of business models. Now, we're in the age of technology right now, and these are just a few examples of ways technology is now impacting the work that we do. And you see things in here that are the result of generative design, that machines doing designs that humans haven't done, can't do in half or fractions of the time. And examples of digital manufacturing, which is changing our world, ways of making things we didn't have before. You know, in the top right of the screen, you can see an engine block or a head that's been generatively designed and 3D printed. And it's about a third as heavy as the traditional way we'd make one of these and has much better cooling properties. That kind of thing is happening kind of right now, changes how we work. And then, lastly, it's this, we're kind of in the rise of the machines. And anybody that's watched movies over the years, there's sort of two futures that are often painted. There's the dystopian, the machines decide they don't need us. They get really smart and realize that we're not helping. Or we work with them in a way that's productive for both of us. You know, the Star Wars, life gets better and we can go out and explore the galaxy model. But clearly this integration between human and machine and what we allow machines to do for us and the thinking they do for us is happening. And here's an example of that, just how powerfully that's happening. This is a recent Bloomberg Business Week article, and I apologize, I took a picture of it. It's a little crooked to cover. But the sooner than you think issue, that picture was drawn by artificial intelligence. That was painted by a program. Now, it painted some other ones that weren't quite as nice, but that's actually a pretty impressive picture. And when you see the spectrum of things it's painted, some are darker, some are lighter, different, you almost get emotions out of them. But look at the subtext there. It's also driving cars, making money, exploring the oceans, and freaking people out. And it is. There are people that are very scared about it. There's some notable thinkers who have said that artificial intelligence is one of the greatest threats we face in the next 20 years. But it is here and it is coming. And so the question is, what do we do about it? What does it mean to us? Let me give an example of our industry. This is a real life example for us. You know, there's a lot of components in vehicles that you don't think about, and seat brackets are probably one of those. But traditionally, you know, a bracket like this might take 8 different components and a lot of design hours for some to do, and maybe there's 2 or 3 variants of it, kind of the way it's been done, plus or minus a little bit. But when you give it to a generative design program and you give it some parameters, it can spin hundreds of designs and come up with ones that are optimized for things that we might not have been able to optimize it for. In this case, it's 40% lighter and 20% stronger. Now, it's going to require some different manufacturing methods, and those aren't fully to scale yet with the way we've done it, but they will be. This will change the way we engineer, the way we design, the way we build, the way you use vehicles. You say, well, what does this mean for me? This is a rendering some of you may have seen from Autodesk that was a concept they'd been working on. This was a conceptual bridge that was generatively designed. What's interesting to me is the elements of nature that you see, and it looks very much to me like the structure of trees, maybe the canopy of trees, which makes some sense when you think about holding up large amounts of weight, being flexible, and the balance with rigidity and strength and things. And their concept was to have robots just welded as they went along. And what's interesting is I saw one of these robots. They taught a robot to MIG weld, basically, and to build things out of metal, because they didn't know you couldn't do that, right? This is a software company who decided to, their CEO put them on a mission to learn how to build things and use their tools. And I saw it build a small version of this. They started with it, they were teaching it to tattoo in erasable ink on folks, but they taught robots to do things that weren't being done before with them. And they're now working on a version of being able to implement this where it's designed by a machine, and you put the robots on one end of the river and they build the bridge across to the other end of the river. And then you go home and you're done. OSHA doesn't have as much to worry about. Changes lots of things about the industry that many of us are in. You think about industry disruption, and again, we're living in a time when if you're not careful, you can take this for granted. But Netflix was founded in 1997. Some of you may remember, initially Netflix were shipping DVDs. And it was kind of a novel thing at the time. You could get DVDs right to your house. You didn't have to go down the road to Blockbuster to rent a DVD. 10 years later, in 2007, they did something revolutionary. They put their previous business out of business. Now that takes a lot of managerial courage. Some of you may have had to face decisions like that, where if you go pursue one area of your business, it literally puts another area of your business at risk. They went into streaming, and they started streaming videos, knowing that the DVD shipping business would go out of business. 5 years after that, in 2012, they did another revolutionary leap, and they started to make TV shows and movies. Some of you remember House of Cards, one of the first big hits that Netflix came out with. 5 years after that, in 2017, they produced over 120 series and movies. They're one of, if not the largest content creator now in the world. They're the same size, they produce as much content as Disney, and they have the same market capitalization as Disney does. That's revolutionary. That's how fast the internet has enabled things to be. And I think sometimes we can be in places where we say, well, yeah, but that's that business, it's not mine. It's ours. This kind of speed and this kind of disruption is and will happen, and in all of the industries. And this is a simple example. And Reed Hastings is a fascinating individual. Started off as a high school math teacher out of college and got into leading Netflix. But a great example of the level of disruption that can happen. They're in 190 countries. I would ask any of us that work for companies that have been around for 20 years or more, how many of us are in 190 countries? I bet you none. And they got into 190 countries in 20 years, realistically in 10, when they put their minds to it. So this is a quote from our CEO, who frankly is fantastic. And every time I have the chance to work with her and interact with her, I'm impressed with the passion she has for who General Motors has been, but more importantly, who we need to be. And this was a quote from about 2015, and she's said this many times, to help us think through the amount of change that really, really, really is going to happen in our industry, so that we can begin to get our heads around what to do about it. And this was literally a 2-week period of news clippings I took, just to kind of give you a flavor for what I mean by change in our industry. And you can see in here things like big data and robots, the fourth industrial revolution, supercharging, so the way vehicles are powered, changing, 5G technology. I would ask you if you thought about what 5G technology means to your business. And if you haven't, you should. You might want to get to know about it. It's going to be disruptive. Car sharing and ride sharing. We've been sharing vacation rentals now for a while. People share content on their movies and DVDs, and more assets are being shared. And if you think about the amount of money that's tied up into assets, whether they be cars or industrial equipment and machinery, construction equipment and machinery, when they're sitting around not being used, the sharing economy is inevitable in some of those, and it's hitting us already for sure. And then interesting article on flying cars, and it turns out that that not only does he have one startup he's backed, this is Larry Page, he's backed 3 flying car startups. Now, this is a pretty smart person. He's one of the co-founders of Google, and that's disruption, right? If you're me, this is pretty disruptive stuff. So I want to tell you about this journey that we started as a company, and a little bit about what we're doing, a little bit as a story that maybe you can relate to. It actually didn't start with Mary's quote in 2015. This journey actually started 79 years ago, in 1939 at the World's Fair, which I'm guessing none of you were at. Physically, I guess some of you maybe could have been. I wasn't around in 1939, but the theme of this World's Fair was the first World's Fair focused on the future. And General Motors had a pavilion that was called Highways and Horizons, and there was this exhibit called Futurama. And during the 2 years of the World's Fair, it was the most visited exhibit. Something like 5 million people went through this exhibit. And when they finished, they walked out with a pin that said, "I have seen the future." Now, the future that this exhibit imagined was 20 years into the future. It was 1960. So in 1939, Norman Bell Geddes was the designer, built this exhibit for the future in 1960. And what did you see when you went in there? Well, you rode a little tram around about a 1 acre diorama. Now that 1 acre diorama was incredibly complex. It had 50,000 individual cars, vehicles. It had 500,000 individually constructed buildings and over 1 million trees that were made to represent the future vision of America in 1960. Now, what you might recognize about this diorama is this is not what cities look like in 1939. This could look like Singapore today or Pudong, China, or some of the big cities in the US. These kinds of buildings weren't built in 1939. What's even more interesting about this is what you don't see in it, which are landing pads on the tops of the buildings for personal flying craft, including this idea of drones, ones that were unmanned or unpiloted flying craft. There were interstate highways that didn't exist at the time in this vision, but more importantly than that, they were autonomous, remote-controlled interstate highways. 1939. Okay, this is before interstate highways were built out. There was a vision of them being autonomous someday, 20 years in the future. So you go 20 years in the future, and you get this. This is 1952 Popular Mechanics, an ad. What do you notice about this family? They're in a vehicle not driving. They're playing a game. Now, they didn't have seatbelts because that was 1952, and no one wore seatbelts. I didn't wear seatbelts as a kid. But this is an autonomous vehicle. It's an ad by an electric company. And look at what the ad says. One day your car may speed along an electric superhighway, controlled by electricity. And look at this, no traffic jams, no collisions, no driver fatigue. 1952, this was the vision. So fast forward now to where we are in 2018. And as a company, this is our worldview. And this is one of the visions that Mary rolled out, is zero crashes, zero emissions, zero congestion. And the N is actually supposed to be on the slide there. I guess that got, she actually does know how to spell congestion. Zero crashes, zero congestion was envisioned in 1952 and 1939. But it wasn't until now that we have the technology, that the technology has caught up with that vision. Think about your industry and the visions people have had. Go back and do a little digging and look at things like 3D printing, for example, the promise that that's had for a long time. And maybe we've dismissed as, nah, not time, not time, not time. Maybe it is time now. So as I thought about this and said, hey, what are we doing about this as an organization, as a company that I might share that could help you think differently? There's this idea of running in parallel, that you're doing one thing and you do something else in parallel. And if I was to draw a line and have you come draw a parallel line, I think our normal reaction would be I draw this parallel line. That's what I was taught in school, is parallel. I think parallel feels more like this in reality. There needs to be a line that is current course and speed in the way we do things. And that might be good for the next 6 months or the next year, but there needs to be another line that's, we're going to try some things that are going to work, and we're going to try some things that aren't going to work, and we got to get comfortable with that mode of operating. And the more I thought about that, the more I realized it's even more complex than that, that really, I think we're used to, and I would say from the previous presentation, this might be the standard way of delivering a project. And think about each of those colored lines as one of the responsible parties, and this is the way we've worked in the past. And maybe we're trying to squish ourselves a little bit together. I think the reality needs to look more like this, that the way we integrate, the way we work, the way work happens within our own organizations and the things that we often will call silos needs to look much more like this second picture and much more fluid. And that has implications on how we do a lot of things. And so we built sort of a little simple model that we talk about within the company as we do some of these projects that we call transformation or transformative projects. And I'll show you a picture of just one or two as it relates to the space we work in and why that matters. But it all starts with who you are and what you want to achieve and what is the culture and the results. And as a company, that's really important, because one of the things you can hang on to in the midst of all kinds of change is, who are we? Fundamentally, who are we? Who do we want to be? And what are the results we're trying to achieve? Not what have we achieved or what have we been. Those are important frames of reference, but who do we want to be going forward? And it starts with leadership. And this is true of any change, and this is true of any integrated project we want to work on or anything you're doing, is if as leaders we aren't doing something different, the chances of having a different outcome are very, very small. Regardless of how we set it up, regardless of the process, everything else we can do right, if we don't behave differently, if we don't do something differently, we're going to have trouble getting a different outcome. So you ask yourself, what am I willing to do differently? What am I willing to walk back to my role and actually do differently? Because if the answer is nothing, then I don't think we can expect a lot of change. What about people? How are we engaging people? I'll show you just a couple of thoughts on what I mean by engaging people. But there have been many surveys have shown that we get about half of the capacity of individuals. And some of you know this to be true in your own lives. You might be in a role that really you could do a lot more if. And we gotta unlock those ifs because we need that capacity and that capability. You know, how much time do you spend in frustrating things where the decisions aren't getting made, you're stuck between things, something isn't happening that actually changes an outcome for a customer? We gotta change that. Our workspaces, and I'll show you some pictures of why and how we're changing our workspaces, but how we work matters. You know, me being up here on stage is a different experience than me talking to you one-on-one or individually. It has a different feel to it. Our workspaces impact how we interact. Technology, and this is one again, if you haven't embraced this as a company, you got to embrace it as fast as you can. And in some ways, knowing that you're going to fail a few times as you try, but we all live this with apps. Most of us now use apps for multiple things in our life, and we jump in and we try them. And sometimes the first version isn't the greatest one, but then it gets better and it gets better, and it's all focused on our user experience, and that needs to be, for a long time, corporate systems have focused on other elements other than user experience. User experience has to be at the forefront of that. And then this idea of work processes. So, you know, integrated project delivery does involve a lot of work process changes, and we have to be able to do work differently if we're willing to lead differently. So, in this environment of change, some of you might have seen this book. It came out several years ago. It's the story of a few mice in a maze, and they were used to going to a certain place in the maze and getting cheese. And each of us, maybe in some way, can relate to, we get rewards by doing certain things certain ways. And one day the cheese was gone. And after a little bit, a couple of mice decided they'd start exploring other places in the maze and look for cheese. And lo and behold, they found some really good cheese in other places. But there were some mice who just refused to leave. They kept thinking, tomorrow the cheese will be here. No, tomorrow the cheese will be here. And they starved to death because they weren't willing to change. And there's some really great, I think, parallels in that story to some of our challenges and how we do things. But there was another book written that came out a few years after that, and it's not a follow-on per se, but it's a book called I Moved Your Cheese. And it tells a little bit of a different story, and it tells about three mice who behaved very differently from the rest of them. And in fact, one of the mice was not interested in cheese, wasn't sure what the big deal with cheese was and why everybody was chasing cheese. One of the mice was asking questions like, well, who put us in the maze? How do I get out of the maze? I want to know what's above the maze. I want to know why I'm in here in the first place. And the third mouse could actually come and go at will through the maze. And there's this really interesting quote in there that's resonated with me over many, many different time periods, is that the problem is not that the mouse is in the maze. The problem is that the maze is in the mouse. How many of us have mazes in our mice that we don't even recognize? We don't realize we're running around in a maze, or we're acting in a way that's effectively a maze because that's all we've ever known. And so we've got to get the mazes out of our mouse. And so how do you do that? How do you think out of the maze? We talk about thinking out of the box. How do you think out of the maze? You know, an interesting study was done that showed that 95% of 5-year-olds are creative. And if you hang around any 5-year-olds, I have a granddaughter who's not quite that old, but she's young enough that she demonstrates the same ability. They are inherently creative. They don't have very many mazes. But yet, that same study said by the time we're 30, only 5% of 30-year-olds are creative. What happens? Now, all of us are creative in some way. Really, the question isn't, are you creative? It's how are you creative, right? Because we all have that ability. But what happens? Well, those of you that hung around 3-year-olds, what's the most common question asked by 3-year-olds? Why? They ask why. Why? Why? And you say, answer it, why? You know, the 5 whys, that came from a 3-year-old. They can do 7 or 8 whys. And sometimes we make the mistake of getting to the point where we say, because I said so. And we often say that because we don't know anymore. Or we're not willing to actually explain it because I don't want to take the time to explain it. You have to use a spoon. Just that's the way we do it. Well, why don't I just pick my bowl up and drink it? Because, right? And so I think we got to start asking ourselves why a lot more than we used to. One of the things we ought to ask ourselves why is, why are we organized the way we are? Why do we have org charts and structures? Think about that, and what's implied in that? And we're shifting how we think about our organization in some fundamental ways that are kind of hard. But you know, it used to be this command and control method where the people at the top knew the answers, and you got promoted if you knew more answers. And so that's how decisions got made, and it was efficient, and we broke work up into little segments, and we had all these different engineers and these architects, and we had all these different trades, and we optimized for efficiency, just like the Industrial Revolution taught us to do. Well, there's some really big downsides to that, and speed and creativity and collaboration are one of the consequences, the negative consequences to some of the structure. So we get into this kind of command of teams idea where, okay, you guys will work as a team, but I'm still in charge and I'll tell you what to do. And so we structure that way, and we'll integrate with, we'll get a little team together, and then I'll command my team and you command your team, and it'll work out. But we got to get beyond that even to this idea of a team of teams. And there's a great book by a U.S. military general on their experiences in the Middle East that's called Team of Teams, that describe a realization they had that they had a structure that was built for the wrong battle. And they were in a fight that was so different that they weren't even equipped to deal with it. Even though they had money and resources, they were losing this battle. And they realized they needed to have a structure that looked much more like this team of teams, where there are relationships between and across, and there's a closeness among individuals when there needs to be, and you solve problems real time. I bet you every one of you has a problem today that if you could pick 4 people and sit at the table with you right now, you could solve that problem in an hour. But you can't get those 4 people at the table. Sometimes you can't get on their calendar for a month, or you can't get 2 of them to agree to even come to the table, or whatever the situation might be. We waste a lot of time and a lot of resources because of the way we're organized and structured. And we need to challenge that within our own institutions and with how we work together. And again, get out of the mazes of why we've done things the way we have in the past, and ask why many times, and then let's think of how we can do it differently. I want to just talk real quick about careers. And it's interesting, as you heard, I've been in some different companies, and being at General Motors for just over 3 years, I'm basically a baby in the company. There's all kinds of people who've worked at General Motors for 30 years or 40 years. That is unfathomable to my children. And I have 4 children who are in the workforce today. Not one of them thinks they're going to work where they are for 40 years. People, that's a maze that nobody thinks anymore. Well, what do they want when they come to work for us? They want to do something that's meaningful. They want meaningful work. I think about my own self, and I was about 9 months after I'd been at GM, I had an opportunity to sit with Mary, the then head of HR, and talk about my experience. And I said, there's 2 reasons I came, and they're the 2 reasons I'm excited to stay. Number 1, I feel like my work matters, that what I do matters, and number 2, I feel valued personally. I think if those 2 things are true, if we all felt valued personally and we felt like our work matters, we would do much more of our best work. That's what people are going to demand who work for us, people coming to work for us. And remember, there are already, depending on the statistics you look at, more millennials in the workforce than not. And they want to do something that's meaningful. They want to build relationships. They want to build connectivity. They often don't want adversarial relationships. One of my daughters is in law, and what she wants is not to be adversarial. She wants to build bridges and find solutions. And careers aren't ladders. You know, we have this image of careers of a ladder. We often talk about going up, or so-and-so's up. And that's really not the way careers are going to work in the future, nor the way, frankly, they should have worked in the past. But there's a great quote from Sheryl Sandberg, who's the COO of Facebook. Career is more like a jungle gym. And people are going to want that, and we need it to be that, to have the learning and the growth and the ideas come. You can't stay in one silo your whole career. First of all, because probably that silo won't exist in 20 years. And second of all, you won't be as effective if that's the only place you are. So, you know, someone that I interacted with recently said this quote, which I really like: if you think what you thought, you get what you got. And old ways won't open new doors. So if we leave this time together today and all the thoughts and ideas you'll hear, and we go back and do things the same way we've done and think the same way we've thought, then we'll be here in a year saying, wow, you know, we really could do better. But we didn't do better, whether it's a burning platform or not. This is just a sample of what do I mean by different, what's changed. This is a simple example of where we work. You know, for many years, we were tied to a desk by a computer and a phone, or a typewriter before that. And there were two kinds of places you were tied to. One was really nice if you were up the ladder, and one was kind of looked like a maze for a mouse if you weren't. Work isn't that way anymore. You know, work is collaborative. People are doing real-time problem solving. Again, I can tell you 5 other examples besides Netflix of things that have literally changed the way we live today, because people that got together that wouldn't have normally got together thought of something. And this last example is made up, but not far from reality in lots and lots and lots of cases, where in a traditional organization or a traditional project, if you look at it that way, a dog trainer, a sociologist, and an engineer wouldn't even be in the same room. They're in different silos and they don't interact with each other. So the world's changing. This is a picture. This is real. It's not photo imaged. We have some projects to transform our space that are very large scale, and we can't do everything at once because we don't have room to put thousands of people other places. So we do them in phases, and this is the completion of one phase bordering a phase we haven't started. In one phase, you see people standing up and talking to each other and interacting, and you can actually see where people are. And in the other phase, you're in the maze, literally in the maze. And what's interesting is, as we do some of these transformations, there are people who come and say, I like the maze. I don't want the maze changed. I like my corner of the maze. I want to be left alone and not bothered in my corner of the maze. Unfortunately, those are mice that are going to starve, because in the world we're in today, that simply doesn't work anymore. I heard this from a colleague who had recently visited MIT, and he heard it at MIT. I don't know where it came from, but I found it interesting that he heard it at MIT. Many of you recognize IQ as intelligence quotient, right? We're familiar with that. But what he heard was that your passion quotient, your PQ, and your curiosity quotient, your CQ, are more important than your IQ. I really believe this is true. Think about your own life. Where have you done your very best work? In something you're passionate about, and something you're curious about. Now, for some of you, it might be something outside of work. In fact, I'm amazed continually by the remarkable things our team members do outside of work. They do incredible stuff, and they come into work, and they put on their regular person jacket that they rarely wear every day at work, but then they go outside and they light the world on fire, because they're PQ and they're CQ. So if you're not passionate about what you're doing, what are you passionate about? And find ways to get those aligned. If you're not curious about what you're doing and why, get curious. Ask yourself why. Hire people who are curious. Maybe not 3-year-olds, but people who think in some of those ways that 3-year-olds think, who haven't grown up to know that's the way we always do it here yet. You know, a couple weeks ago I met with Stephen Mulvin. He was talking to me about a study that the CII is working on relative to the construction industry. Now, the construction industry as a whole is just over 6%, and this is gross output by industry, most recent data, just over 6% of the total gross output of the United States. $1.4 trillion, almost $1.5 trillion in gross output. That is a really, really meaningful industry. As you can see on the chart, bigger than mining, utilities, agricultural, forestry, fishing combined. So you represent a really, really key element of our output as a country. And Stephen said this, hey, up to 40% of some of the project we've studied is waste. And I started thinking about that, and I said, no, that can't be. We're better than that. We do these integrated projects, and we're not that wasteful. And then I started thinking about the time that goes into things, how long it takes to get a PO approved and created, or a contract written, how many meetings, design reviews. I started thinking of all these things that don't actually end up in what I deliver to our customer, and I was shocked. I thought, maybe it is 40%. Maybe we are spending all kinds of money and time and effort, and I look through all the supply chain and everything, and I think, wow, this is a humongous opportunity, but it's going to require a very, very different maze and some very different mice if we're going to capitalize on that and not try to do the way it's always been play. And it might be tempting, and I've heard people on our team say this, it might be tempting to say, well, yeah, but you know, no one else can disrupt us. If we don't change, no one else changes, we'll all be okay. The world doesn't work that way. Blockbuster Video thought that. Disney thought that. Sony Records thought that. You know, I can give you 20 more examples of insurance, you name it. In 10 years, my granddaughter might not want to drive a car. That's really disruptive. And I'm in an industry that has a lot of capital barriers, and you know, it's hard to make a car, as some of our vocal competitors are proving. It's harder than it really might seem. But you know what? What if people don't want a car? That's a really different challenge. So we have a challenge here to take our position in the important role we play in the economy and think differently about it in a way that can unlock tremendous value. And so I'll just conclude with this challenge. What future can you imagine? Have you imagined it? Have you sat around and thought about what the future might do? What would it take to put your business out of business tomorrow? What, if it happened, would take what you do and make what you do irrelevant tomorrow or unnecessary tomorrow? And take that knowledge then and say, what does that mean for me today? What am I going to now do differently? Maybe I'll go do that on purpose, like Netflix did with some of their businesses. Maybe I will put part of my business out of business because I want to enable the future. Or maybe I'll get curious about my own role and see what I can do to make sure that in 3 or 4 or 5 years, I'm contributing in a way that's incredibly relevant. So I'll leave you with this challenge. We're at a phenomenal time in the world. I think we'll look back at this time as all those things that change is, scary and frightening and threatening, but wonderful and opportunistic, because we have tools and capabilities that we've never had before, and we can change the world in really meaningful and powerful ways. So thank you.
Thank you, Dane. Excellent talk and very wide-ranging subjects that you talked about. So I think it was a very meaningful discussion, so I appreciate that. And we did get several questions from the audience, so I'm going to ask a few of these. I think we have time for 2 or 3. And there was a lot of interest around autonomous vehicles and that new technology that we're working on within General Motors. And so the question is, how soon will self-driving cars or autonomous vehicles dominate the auto industry? And perhaps what are some of the barriers that you see in making that a reality?
Yeah, so I'd reframe the question. It's a great question, and one we ask ourselves a lot, obviously. If you change the word to dominate, from dominate to change, the answer is today. And next year, some of you will be able to take a ride in an autonomous taxi in cities in the United States. It'll be safe, comfortable, and you won't talk to anybody but whoever you want to be in your taxi with you. That'll happen next year. That's reality. How long will it take before you don't need to drive? If you're in a big city, maybe it'll be 10 years, maybe it'll be 15 years. There are cities in Europe that are working on legislation to ban combustion vehicles already. And it won't be long once autonomous starts to prove that it works before people start passing laws that they don't want you driving a car in their city because you're going to put everybody else at risk. So that'll happen, I think, in the next 10 to 15 years. If you live in a rural area and you drive a truck and pull a trailer, maybe it'll be around a lot longer. So we'll be in this transition phase of what does power our vehicles and who drives them for the next, 10 to 15 years. But agricultural equipment, as many of you know, is already autonomous. Most of the planes that fly today fly autonomously for large parts of their flights. Other things are getting done autonomously, big rigs. That transition's going to impress a lot of us with how quickly it happens.
Great. The next question, besides the change in technology that needs to be managed, what are 2 other areas that you see GM needing to manage or prepare for? And you can perhaps take that into the facilities or construction part of the business, or into the automotive side.
Yeah, I think effectively there are only 2 areas, right? There's technology and there's people. And sometimes the technology one is easier for us to talk about, maybe because it's it versus we. But think about if you just got hired to GM and you're working on 8-cylinder gas engines. You think you're going to be working on 8-cylinder gas engines when you retire? No. So how do we transition? If you're a structural engineer today in your firm, are you going to be doing structural engineering in 10 years, in 5 years? Or is an AI program going to be doing structural engineering? Those are people kind of questions, and I think that's one of our biggest challenges. How do you fully engage what we bring uniquely as people in our capacity to the problems that we have to bear? And you have to work on them both together, and you have to be transparent about the implications of them.
Okay. The next question is really a people type question. It's a little bit of an interesting question, and I'll do a little add on at the end. But it says, when you interview someone, how can you discern the person who job hops for virtuous reasons from one who does so for misguided reasons? And then how would you quantify millennials relative to these buckets? So I know another part of that question is perhaps the traditional General Motors employee, and now we've got an influx of millennials coming in. So how do you manage all that, I guess, in the context of this question?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So let me answer the hiring one first. You talk to people about what they're passionate about and what they're curious about. Many companies, when they hire, don't look at what your education is, how many years of experience they have. They ask, what was the most exciting thing you did in the last 6 months, and how did it work out? And you'll begin to hear what they're excited and passionate about. And if what they're passionate about and curious about isn't what you're hiring them for, don't hire them. If it is, hire them and keep them excited and passionate, and they'll stay around, right? In terms of millennials, I like to think of millennial, frankly, as more a way of thinking than an age. And I think that's many of us, I think, are going to be thinking more like millennials, regardless of what age we are. And so our ability to give people work that is meaningful, that aligns with what they're passionate about, where their skills, their passions, and the work have a much bigger overlap versus just a career. Let people stretch, give them opportunities that are beyond themselves. I think that will help us with the millennial workforce. And it'll help us with those of us in other generations who have some of those same thoughts and maybe have expressed those in our non-work pursuits instead of our work pursuits.
Sure. I think that is about our time limit for today before we release everyone for lunch. So I really want to thank you. I think it was an outstanding discussion, an outstanding talk. And once again,